Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am Paul Brody. I'm the global blockchain leader at EY, and I am really delighted to have you here joining us for what is an incredibly valuable and important topic, which is the path to net zero, right? It is a monumentally important topic for the entire world, but also I think it is one of the really most important areas where blockchain can shine and make a really positive contribution in a way that's constructive and positive, and it's frankly really different from a lot of the sort of financial engineering that we've talked about in the past. This is about kind of making a globally scalable, practical contribution to driving us towards net zero. And I am joined today by two incredible guests for our discussion. The first is Nicholas Alexander, who is the head of partnerships at Thallo, and also my colleague, Tom Garlick, who's a senior manager at EY. And I'm going to ask each of these amazing people to introduce themselves before we get started.
Hi, everyone. I'll go first. So Nick Alexander, head of partnerships at Thallo. So super excited to be here. And thank you once again for the invitation. My own background was that I used to work in the public sector as a diplomat, working primarily in international development. I then worked at the UN before doing an MBA so as to pivot into climate tech. Thallo is a climate solutions company providing whole of market access to carbon credits. We do this in two ways, through one-off purchases via our exchange, but also through APIs that allow our clients to build in carbon credits into products and services. We believe blockchain is the carbon market's next frontier, enabling the market to scale with integrity. However, blockchain is not a panacea and must be done carefully with the right guardrails and with a really strong understanding of climate needs. Blockchain's applications must also be grounded in actual practical use cases with real value accruing to stakeholders involved. So I think I'm really excited to talk today about how we're going to move from the abstract to the practical applications of blockchain with regards to net zero. And yeah, super excited to be here today.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Tom Garlick, also very excited to be here. Many thanks to CoinDesk for having us today. I'm a senior manager and solution architect in EY's blockchain practice, and I'm currently focused on leading ESG and sustainability solutions for our clients. I have a background in software engineering and solution architecture. Before joining EY, I worked in the fintech space for quite a while, building SaaS product and service solutions. I'm also leading a task force to build some carbon emission token standards with the Interwork Alliance. So deeply involved there and really looking forward to our conversation today. Thanks so much. Back to you, Paul.
Fantastic. Thank you both. So I'm going to get us started with, I'll call it a little bit of context setting, because it's really useful to understand the size and the scale of kind of what's at stake here and the size of the investment opportunity. We talk broadly about the sort of broad ESG category, and it's not just something that's interesting to do. It's something that's going to generate tens of trillions of dollars of investment and very substantial return on investment. So what I'd like to do is maybe let's flip this over and let's talk about, let's go into some slides, because we can't have good discussion without slides, right? That's like required. And let's talk about what is going to be required. And let's set a little bit of context. Just decarbonizing the US electrical grid over the next 10 to 15 years is expected to cost somewhere in the range of $4 to $5 trillion. Right now, that's, if you think of the US as roughly a third of kind of the global big economies, right? That means that globally, we're talking about a $15 trillion investment, another 4 or 5 trillion in kind of education related opportunities that will help to transform our economy, and then potentially another $3 to $5 trillion in the US alone, just related to climate change adaptation. So across the board, we're talking about a very substantial amount of investment. And one of the things that's really encouraging is this investment is actually generating like some pretty solid returns. So if you look at IRRs on college degrees, utility scale renewables, climate change adaptation, they're all higher than what we typically expect, right? This is not a public service, this is an investment. And it turns out to be actually a pretty good investment. And it's not an accident that you see a lot of the world's top companies already publicly committing to get to net zero, right? This is a very big deal. EY, of course, is one of those, as are plenty of other, and I think we're in really good company. But this isn't a It's not a $0 investment. It's quite substantial, but it should generate some pretty substantial returns. Now, one of the things that we talk a lot about and think a lot about, because we're an audit firm and an accounting firm, is verifiability. It doesn't just mean that you can sort of say, hey, I've got some carbon offsets, right? First of all, you've got to reliably try to decarbonize your grid. But secondly, where you do have carbon output, you do have to think about offsetting it, right? Now, the ideal goal, in some sense, in the simplest way, is like the math should be simple, right? I emit carbon, I offset carbon, and I get to zero. That's a very nice kind of easy way of thinking about it. But in practice, it's much, much harder to get there, right? How do we avoid double spending? How do we avoid, kind of people changing the definitions to suit them? How do we track products that have carbon outputs as they travel around the world? I personally think, and I think lots of people agree with me, that Ethereum in particular is potentially a really, really good environment for managing this traceability, decarbonization, and offset. Right. First of all, it's global and decentralized, right? There is no one participant that controls this network. It is a level playing field for all the participants. Secondly, it's interoperable. One of the great things about tokenization is it's a really fantastic way of standardizing assets or liabilities or responsibilities, right? And because it's interoperable, if we can define what looks like a standard carbon emission, and we can define what looks like an agreed upon acceptable carbon offset, right? Then we can actually track those as they move around the world, right? In a very consistent way. And by the way, thanks to the blockchain nature, we can also always trace back the source of these emissions to the point of origin. This is immensely important. This is not about greenwashing. It's not about sort of hiding your accountability. It's about having full traceability and visibility end to end. And it's permissionless. Everybody can participate. We can build on assets that are developed by others. We're not going to block up our entire path forward with some kind of veto-based, governance by committee process where everybody gets a veto. It's permissionless. That means the best solutions in this ecosystem are the ones that are going to go forward. Right. In terms of key considerations, right, there's quite a few of them, and I don't want to steal any more thunder. I want to hand over to, I think it's Nicholas. Are you next? You're our next speaker, right?
I believe it's Tom.
I think I'm
Tom,
up.
my mistake. Okay, yeah. Tom, I want Tom to talk about the details. Tom is part of our global blockchain team. He is actually working on these implementations. And so, Tom, you're up here, and please tell us about kind of what the key considerations are and how we make things operate in the way that we would all like them to, which is transparently and fairly.
Yes, fantastic. Thanks, Paul. So I want to start by some of the key considerations and challenges that we ran into in our project. I think that you may encounter when trying to implement ESG traceability and solutions on the blockchain. I think first a little context. So, our emissions tracking and traceability and the tokenization of emissions, our primary focus is on decarbonization, helping companies to really catalog, track, have that attestation to their ESG claims on the blockchain. But the first step is decarbonization. And then secondly, there's sort of mitigation, between as you improve operations and reduce your carbon across operations, bring that down, there's things you can do and take advantage of this time, such as or offset some of your carbon footprint as it pertains to your organization or product. So, but this project, I want to talk about verifiability, interoperability, and privacy, and some of the key challenges we encountered. This was a digital product passport product that we were working on. We had two main objectives. First, we wanted to tokenize the product itself, or the passport itself. And this was really about the traceability, the provenance, and the materials across the supply chain, to their use, to their secondary use, through to recycling in a circular economy mode, with a lot of requirements driven out of the EU. And then secondly, we needed to trace and track the environmental impact along with the movement of those goods. And so that was the tracking of the emissions and carbon footprint and tokenizing those emissions as well. So that's what we set out to do. And this is, these three aspects are what we're really looking for. This use case, I think many like it, verifiability of the data is paramount. It's one of the purposes of using the blockchain in this context, is to have the data be independently verifiable, immutable, a permanent record to test your ESG claims. And the blockchain is a great platform to do that. It's also an important way to avoid greenwashing, having this on-chain attestation. I'll talk a little bit more on how we achieved verifiability on the next slide, but let me just mention interoperability and privacy here as well. So interoperability, this is really key to having these assets now tokenized work together. So a passport token, emissions tokens, carbon credit tokens that Nick is going to talk a little bit more about. How can we have these assets commingled in an environment where we can leverage either transferability or offsetability or other transactions? So they need to be interoperable. And then finally, there's privacy. So, one of the key requirements for our the digital product passport was about data availability, was about transparency. However, we don't want to give away trade secrets in that context. So we need to balance that transparency with privacy of the right data. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well, and how we achieve that, or some mechanisms for achieving privacy. Let me just kind of go to the next slide.
Before you go on, so Tom, we're taking questions from the audience,
Okay.
right? And everybody wants to know where you got the cool EY hoodie. But in addition to that, there's an actual question, a substantive question, which is, do you have the ability to segregate the balances, like maybe, I think perhaps the total carbon emissions that somebody has made, from traceability? So in other words, I think what the question is really about is like, can I see who originally created a set of carbon, even though maybe the token has moved on, or I've implemented a privacy solution?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that is one of our key goals. And I'm going to get into that a little bit as well, just want to touch on standards. But so we have defined a carbon emissions token that has a data model that's traceable back to its source. And when that token is transferred, that record is permanently captured and auditable on the blockchain. So you can always trace it back to its owner, the emitter, its source, even down to the equipment that caused the emissions to begin with. So that's it. That's a yes. Yeah, I will advance to the next slide here. So how do we address those challenges? I mentioned verifiability, interoperability, privacy, and I'm going to take them one by one because those were our objectives. That's what we wanted to achieve, but each one was an obstacle for us. And so the first one was really all about a data methodology. And depending on the level or quality of data, you have options in terms of how to collect the data. But this is a big challenge on the front end when you're gathering data for products through the supply chain, or when you're trying to trace the emissions and gather the emissions data to tokenize it. You can, for instance, have a certified process that helps you, follow a consistent standard for collecting and measuring the data. Or you could have more of a full-scale auditable methodology that's audited annually as a thorough way to have that independently verifiable data. That's what we did and went forward, would recommend. But just some components of that, you have collection and measurement. Can the data be directly and continuously measured? Can you leverage IoT sensors or meters or other devices that can collect and log data? Those are key items there. And regarding verification, how do you have a systematic, independent, and documented process that considers, among other things, a variety, when you get into GHG protocol and other standards, you have to consider physical and temporal boundaries and other factors. Do you have a process for that? And then finally, how about validating the data? Do you have records that satisfy your pre-established requirements, conditions, criteria for the validation? So all of these are key aspects for the methodology and the data collection on the front end. Okay, and the next challenge was interoperability, and how do we get there? And I did touch on this a little bit per the question, but it's really about what we did is we went looking for industry standards. We needed a way, and by the way, when I talk about standards here, this is just a little different context. I'm not really referring to like Ethereum's ERC 2721 or 1155, kind of a level above that, looking at a data standard for carbon emission token. How do we model the data? What are its behaviors? What type of token does it need to be? Those sorts of standards. And I want to mention, That last bullet there, the IWA and GBBC. So the IWA is an organization called the Interwork Alliance. It's an initiative of the Global Blockchain Business Council, and that's out there building standards to empower organizations to really bring interoperability to global networks and global blockchain solutions. And so some of the work we're doing there now, I just, a couple pieces of the puzzle, but this is why you want to go find standards. A lot of this is difficult. You have to build a taxonomy to have this common language and classification, data model and structure, identify the behaviors and token types. And so these standards were our vehicle to the interoperability. And then finally
Sorry,
Sure.
Tom,
Yep.
I'm going to just interject a question here because it came in and when you were talking to me, and it's the same question, right? Even though you said, I don't want to address a specific token standard, I believe that they are looking for a specific semi-fungible token standard. Is that right?
It is, yeah. For carbon emissions in particular, there's cases where they benefit from fungibility. Two can be exchanged equally, but we still need the uniqueness factor. Back to the earlier question, the unique properties of those emissions that can trace it back to source. So we need both.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. So just moving along on to privacy is the other challenge. And so the privacy is really, the transaction privacy is what needs to be addressed when we're transferring these tokens, when we're using the interoperability, when we're offsetting tokens. We want to have certain data transparent, certain data we want to keep private. And so how do you go about that? What are some of the approaches? I've got a few I'll name. So the first one, you can partition the data in such a way that only a hash is stored on chain, and you can keep the data, metadata off chain in a centralized database. It's only allowed for certain parties. And you still get benefits of the blockchain because parties can still request the data and verify that it hasn't been changed since then. But that's a tougher one. A second one would be to write your own zero knowledge proofs, which would enable you to prove the veracity of a claim or of the data without revealing the underlying data. But that's a non-trivial exercise, a pretty heavy lift that requires expertise. Thirdly, you could leverage an industry tool like a Polygon Nightfall, which not only enables you to perform transactions under privacy, but it also allows it actually also reduces transaction costs, increases transaction speeds as well because of the performance. And then finally, there's also emerging tech on zero knowledge EVMs are emerging that can provide privacy for blockchain applications. So that is how we addressed those challenges.
Right. Now, just to be clear, for the EY solutions, we are actually planning on deploying on public Ethereum, and we're going to, or the Polygon proof of stake network, and we're going to use the Nightfall layer 2 privacy solution to enable transaction privacy. So this is something that's kind of really important for us. It is possible to deploy these on a private permission chain, and this is one of the questions that came in from the audience. But when you deploy on a private permission chain, you are, in a sense, defeating the purpose of having this kind of global decentralized public infrastructure that's shareable and transactable.
Yeah, such a great point, Paul. I mean, so many benefits that you can get out of a public blockchain. But I moved to the next slide just to give us this 100,000-foot view of, so, where does this leave us? Where do we come to here? And this is just a kind of a rough depiction of an environment where we're operating a carbon emissions platform, where you can see in the upper left corner an organization that is tracking and collecting data for their scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. They're validating the data. It's being tokenized and brought into the platform. And on the right side, in the upper right, you can see there's, let's see, it talks about a project, and this is really referring to ecological projects that are removing carbon from the atmosphere and having that verified, documented, registered with one of the carbon registries, and eventually tokenized, so we can then have a carbon credit token represented. And again, this is the mitigating step that organizations can leverage while you're reducing your carbon emissions. But once we have this now carbon emission tokens, and we've allocated those to a product, for example, and now we have a carbon credit as well, we can apply the credit as an offset to our carbon footprints. And we can, and the result is a carbon neutral product, which customers and clients and investors and regulators can be very happy about your ESG claims. And this is all, these transactions are all provable and signed and verified on the blockchain. And so that is the platform view. And Nick is going to tell us a little bit more about some of the challenges of carbon markets when they're not backed by a blockchain, but he's also going to share some of the benefits of a blockchain-enabled carbon market. So over to you.
Thank you. And just looking one last bit at this slide, and carbon markets are the center there. But I think once again, to reiterate what you said, we have to remember that carbon offsetting is the last piece of the puzzle. Decarbonization is what needs to happen first, but it has to be kind of high carbon offsetting with high quality credits, which comes now to the some of the problems in the market. So I won't go through like a carbon market 101 because that could take a year almost. But essentially, the carbon market is, Paul, you mentioned three things earlier: transparent, fair, and verifiable. None of those three words would apply to the carbon market as generally known today. And that's, because of three, you could chunk it into three categories here. There's a general lack of trust because of market opacity and the lack of auditability between the carbon asset and the end environmental claim. That reduces trust. There's a risk of greenwashing. Let's not forget, it's a voluntary market. Corporates are voluntarily financing these climate saving projects on the ground. So they don't want to have any risk of greenwashing because that's going to come back and bite them. So they need super robust systems in order to do so. And then finally, we spoke a lot about unifying standards. There is no unifying centralized standard because this is not a regulated market. It's actually a private market. And once again, it's invest at your own peril. So we need to make it better because it will play such an important with regards to achieving net zero. It's also inefficient and clunky. So I don't know if anyone's ever tried to purchase carbon offset. It's very, very difficult in the absence of without going through an intermediary. So once I wanted to purchase directly from a project based in the Amazon, I had to send my passport, sign contracts, KYC, an absolute nightmare. So think about that. And in a market where there's so much friction, that's so much potential for intermediaries and essentially value sapping away from the climate mitigating projects on the ground, which is a real problem. And finally, it's inequitable. So there's a lot of intermediaries, there's a lot of upfront costs, and basically capital doesn't always flow down to the beneficiaries due to lack of traceability and transparency, and the fact that we can't properly track the flow of financing. People don't really trust that the money goes to the climate projects on the ground. And then finally, the secondary market, so this resale market of carbon credits, is absolutely immense. There's some estimates that say, if the carbon market is around 2 billion, then the secondary market could be 2 to 3 times that. So, obviously it's a market with some challenges. And so here in the next slide, I'll talk about where blockchain could fit in. Now,
hey, Nick, before you go there, I got a couple questions for you. So the first is and these are questions from the audience. What does GBBC stand for?
That's for you.
Okay, I can take that one. So that is Global Blockchain Business Council, and they are a standards body. Yeah, standards body. Yeah. They're doing a lot of work on digitized standards and tokenization as well for blockchain.
And then another one that came in was, okay, we've been talking about token taxonomy for almost a decade. Is there a token taxonomy that you are following or a set of, what are the specific standards or who is laying out the standards and taxonomies that you guys are actually following?
Yeah, so great question. So I work closely, I have to say, the caveat, work closely with our climate change and sustainability services team at EY. And those are our climate scientists bringing all that expertise to help define the ins and outs. And so, but we're leveraging like the GHG protocol. For one, there's the Pathfinder framework, WRI materials as well. So we're trying to harmonize a variety of frameworks and reporting standards into a token that can provide that traceability of your emissions. Not an easy task. And I think, one thing too that needs to be stated, the tokenization of the carbon isn't really meant to replace your reporting tools and systems. It's really meant to work in complement with them, because your reporting tools are what's going to help you drive down your emissions and improve efficiencies. The tokenized carbon is what's going to help you essentially prove your ESG claims on the blockchain, tested those claims.
Correct. And without adding to the kind of soup of letters and the acronyms, in the traditional carbon market, there are a number of standard setters, including the VCMI, which is the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, and a whole host of others who are trying to set standards as to what a credible claim is, what a credible carbon offset is. But I'm sure we can share some of these resources afterwards. Kind of going back to potentially the use cases of blockchain and carbon markets, we can instill a lot of trust. I mean, it's the name of the game when it comes to blockchain. And here there's two elements that are key: the traceability and auditability of those projects. The actual verifiable impact that they have on the ground. You can put that on chain, and that adds to the robustness of the accounting, but also to those end environmental claims, which are so important for making those ESG, for ESG writ large. Secondly, if you think about composability is so important when you think about layering in data or layering in trust. So just by way of example, if I digitize a carbon credit, I'm taking that information, which is actually the guardians of that information typically are registries, so Gold, Standard, or Vera, and I'm actually digitizing that information. But to complement that information, I could add carbon rating agencies or digital monitoring, reporting, and verification. All of these different layers of trust supplement the information on that project and add credibility to the end environmental claim, whilst also reducing the risk of greenwashing for both corporates and individuals. So super, super important in terms of building trust. Efficient and dynamic. So, we talked about how clunky the market is elsewhere. So with blockchain and with kind of a central platform, you can essentially provide market-wide access to portfolios across project types and geographies. And so one forgets that, carbon credits are not made all the same. The one attribute that binds them all together is the fact that they have one ton of carbon associated with it. But they have such a vast variety of different projects. You can purchase projects for $5 a ton, for $600 a ton. And so, that market-wide access and aggregation allows you to build bundles aligned with your ESG goals, which is, once again, super important. Frictionless trading, once again, this is a unique property to digital carbon because we allow for dynamic trading across the marketplaces. But perhaps most importantly, equitable and impactful. So I described how inefficient the market is and how that allows for an ecosystem ripe for intermediaries. Well, disintermediation means that more of the capital is flowing directly to the projects on the ground, wherever they may be. Moreover, something unique to blockchain is that you can add smart contracts into the token. So if I'm digitizing the carbon credit and all the information therein, one of the things I can do is add a code, smart contract, that provides a royalty fee similar to NFTs seen elsewhere to all secondary trades. So you're allowing project developers to tap into these secondary markets and extending the value capture they can get and improving their ability to finance their projects on the ground. So these are just some examples of the things that we're building. And I'll just go one more slide just to describe down here, how it actually looks like in practice for Thala. So once again, we see ourselves as a supply-side aggregator. So we aggregate across projects and work directly with the registries, whether it be Gold, Standard, Vera, or others. And we provide a two-way bridge that digitizes those carbon credits. Those digital carbon credits can be used in two ways. The first could be via the Thala exchange, which is an ecosystem allowing for buying, selling, trading, and retiring of carbon credits, primarily for corporates, traders, and otherwise. But there's also bridging as a service, which is essentially white labeling digitization, enabling corporates or consultancies to essentially benefit from digital carbon credits, which are more robust, more accessible, to build out new use cases, to integrate directly into audit trails, to have fractionalized e-commerce, which is reliable, which is robust, and to build essentially the next generation of carbon credits, and hopefully, help fight climate change. So I'll stop there because I think we're about to go into a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, so the first question that comes to mind is something you said to me, Nick, and showed up in the questions as well, which is, like you said, there's credits that are available for $5 and there's credits that are available for $600. Like, how can these possibly be the same?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So, once again, the one thing that brings credits all together is the 1 ton of avoided carbon or reduced carbon, right? But there's a lot of different ways you can do that. You can either grow trees in the Amazon or preserve parts of the Amazon. That has like biodiversity and social development benefits. Essentially, you can't really quantify these benefits, so that would actually add to the price. There are other types of more expensive removal technologies. So for instance, you're thinking of direct air capture, typically done in Greenland. That is very, very expensive technologies that need a lot of upfront capital, and you need financing now. But they're going to be needed in 30 years so as to decarbonize. So, if you compare growing a patch of trees with a direct air capture, it's a completely different project. And so, people need help to navigate that market and to navigate the kind of claims that they can make on the back of those carbon offsets. And, you need to build really robust, traceable, and transparent infrastructure to do so.
What happens if, like, somebody burns down that forest of carbon capture that I have in the Amazon, right? If it's direct air capture, it's going to go into some kind of mine, right? But the more biological ones are maybe at risk. Like, these things are not guaranteed that they'll stay in place forever.
Yeah, correct. And then so you're touching on something that's called permanence. So permanence is another driver of price in the market. Essentially, permanence means how long is the action that has taken place, that has been financed, likely to avoid, sequestrate, or capture carbon for a period of 50 odd years. So the direct air capture example might be 1,000 years, which is great. But perhaps the forest one might be 50 or 60 years. That's less good. But if you think about all of the importance, co-benefits, and the importance of preserving nature as is, all of the biodiversity that's captured in that forest, it's impossible to put them like for like. And so the best solutions, I believe, are ones that you're actually using your kind of carbon offsetting budget to both have finance those futuristic solutions which will be needed, but also preserve what we have. Biodiversity loss is absolutely cataclysmic at the moment. And so without financing some of these projects, the illegal loggers are just going to come in. So it's a combination of both.
So how do you turn, this is one of my kind of big questions, how do you then turn like a commitment by a Fortune 1000 company to be net zero? How do you turn that into an investable asset, that committed flow for decarbonization or offsets, into something that a carbon capture project or a biodiversity protection project can monetize today? Because all of these projects need money today in order to build infrastructure and scale for the future.
Right. Well, so I think first, Tom could probably speak to the ESG journey of that carbon, this typical corporate, right? So usually it's not out of philanthropy. They're making an ESG claim, right? And they benefit from those ESG claims with regards to consumers, with regards to finance, right? But there is a lot of willing to do good, but difficulty in navigating these markets. And what you need is a rather kind of sophisticated carbon offset strategy, really, which is why having these one-stop shop kind of products that for instance EY is doing, which allows you to both manage your emissions, but also in the same hand manage your carbon offsetting strategy. That's where it becomes really, really quite interesting.
Nick, I a quick follow-up question on the Paul's question about burning down the forest, and this is kind of the technical geek side of me coming out, but if a carbon credit is issued and tokenized onto the network, and the forest does burn down, it's no longer permanent, and maybe we've actually offset some of our footprint with retired a portion of that credit. Can you is there a technical mechanism to revoke those or to somehow dial back because that credit is no longer viable, or would that be the remedy there? Or Not sure if there's a use case or workaround.
No, that's a very important question. And so what I should have probably mentioned is that carbon credits are always issued ex ante. That's why they have a vintage date associated with them. So when you're actually paying for a carbon credit, you're not paying them to do something in the future. You're actually paying them for something that has already happened, which is an important distinction. So essentially, you can have confidence in knowing that, a year worth of that, in the case of the forest in the Amazon, of that patch of trees has actually already been sequestering carbon for that period of time. So you have confidence in that claim. Now, that claim also presupposes that forest, is going to be there in 30 years. And just sometimes, as we saw in California recently, and the west coast of the U.S., there are forest fires that are kind of unmitigated risk, and you can't really manage for them. So the way that they do that is they take conservative baselines with regards to calculating the amount of carbon captured or avoided, gone into the air, and B, they have significant buffers whereby they can actually replace some of the carbon in the calculation, such that if there was an accident, then they've overcompensated already.
Gotcha.
So one question that comes up all the time is, should we be doing this on a blockchain given the carbon footprint of blockchains? And I think this reflects the fact a lot of people don't know about sort of carbon neutral and the merge and things like that. Tom, maybe you could talk a little bit about why we think there's no hypocrisy in tracking carbon emissions and offsets on a blockchain.
Yes, no, absolutely. That does come up quite a bit, and that's one of the reasons that we're not tracking emissions on a blockchain, say like Bitcoin, because absolutely true that it is a high energy consumer, given its consensus mechanism, which is proof of work on Bitcoin. Ethereum used to be proof of work, recently converted their consensus mechanism to proof of stake, which doesn't require the same, they reduced their carbon footprint by like 98% or some extreme amount. So it actually became quite energy efficient, on par with standard processing in data centers across the world. So no extra burden on the atmosphere for carbon emissions. And I think there are other blockchain protocols as well that are also, Polygon came into the mix, is also quite eco-friendly in the way that its carbon footprint is low. Its transaction throughput can be high and low cost, get benefits there. There are many other protocols that tend to be much lower energy consumers than something like a Bitcoin protocol.
Fantastic. So I've got one question left for Nick, and then I want to get I'll call it a closing comment from each one of you. So Nick, you talked about, you sort of dropped a couple of numbers earlier about market size. You said the primary market is 2 billion and the secondary market might be much larger, or I might have gotten those numbers reversed. How big is this market actually? Because 2 billion or 20 billion seems really small in the context of a $15 trillion global decarbonization effort. Is that, should we be expecting this thing to kind of explode in size? And how big should it get?
Correct. Yeah, indeed, it is a very, very small market as is, and that's why it's kind of annoying when you see people say, "Oh, well, carbon offsetting should be done better in X, Y." It's just one small piece of the puzzle right now. But the reason why people think it's important and it's going to grow so much is basically because of the number of net zero commitments that corporates are making today. And those net zero commitments follow kind of a net zero trajectory, which involves a lot of decarbonization, but also unabatable emissions, right? And that's what we're talking about when we think about offsetting. And so if you're looking at the amount of different commitments and unabatable emissions across different industries, what you can see is that the demand for the carbon credits in the market is almost baked in. You can almost see how much it's going to be just based on public commitments. But the supply side isn't there, because you guys mentioned it yourself, right? It takes a while for these projects to kick off. And so you need capital today. And so, I think that some of the estimates are the market will grow to, 5x to 10 billion in the next, 5 years, but could be as large as 50 billion by 2030, something of the kind. But what's really interesting is that the companies taking action now, who are investing in carbon credits, whether it be at the spot market now, or even in forwards and futures, and basically hedging their decarbonization strategies so as to get better pricing and be able to say, hey, we're financing climate action now. That's a really interesting play for some of the more sophisticated corporates who are looking very seriously at their net zero strategies.
Excellent. So I want to go and get like some closing comments. Maybe what is if you're an enterprise and you want to involve yourself and figure out how to support the scaling of this marketplace, what should you be doing? What would be the first steps? Maybe I'll start with you, Tom, and then we'll go to you, Nick, for those closing comments and recommendations in terms of strategy and action.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think, if you're an organization looking at this, the first thing that you want to do is what we talked a little bit about on the topic of verifiability, and that is really getting your arms around your data. For the tracking and traceability, what shape is your data in? Whether it's you want to track the provenance of materials in your supply chain or their associated carbon footprint, do you have that mechanism in place? Do you have calculations on the data for allocating your carbon footprints to different aspects of your organization, whether it's your activities or your products or what? So I think that's kind of the first step, and where we start is with the data and getting your arms around good quality data, figuring out that piece. I think from there, it's really about looking forward at your goals and looking forward at your stakeholders and your community. And do you need, this provable attestation to your ESG claims that's going to be immutable and permanent for your stakeholders to see and access, and even folks who you're even not aware of, be they consumers or future employees, to know, to have this provable story about your ESG journey published outside of your organization. And so if those are some of your key goals and criterias and looking forward, blockchain technology provides a great path to success.
Fantastic. And Nick, closing comments from you.
Yeah, so I would say, take a holistic, measured, but also ambitious approach to carbon offsetting, and think about the standards that you're wishing to attain and the digital infrastructure that is going to help you get there. Because that ultimately is what we're trying to build here. We're trying to build structures that enable for auditable, transparent, and robust environmental claims, such that your consumers and your financiers can trust the ESG claims that you make. And part of that process is a robust, transparent, and credible carbon market. And play with the right people. Don't, just because they exist, go with brokers who have peripheral connections with projects on the ground. Do your research and understand that there are really great mechanisms to channel your financing to where it's needed most.
Fantastic. Well, this has been a great discussion, a really good start. I thank my two guests who are experts and incredible contributors. And I thank everybody who tuned in and all the people who sent in questions. Thank you very much. I'm Paul Brody. I'm the Global Blockchain Leader at EY, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.